She was only 25 when she placed the crown upon her head, and yet the weight of a fractured kingdom rested heavily on her narrow shoulders. It was the year 1558, and England was still reeling from the chaos of her half-sister's reign, Queen Mary Tudor. They remembered not for stability or peace, but for the pyres lit in the name of faith, and the hundreds of lives turned to ash. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, the world saw not a sovereign, but a symbol of vulnerability, a young, unmarried woman in a court of scheming men, surrounded by foreign threats, religious fractures, and the ghost of civil war. To survive, she knew she had to become something more than human. She would have to become a myth. Elizabeth did not merely wear the crown, she forged an identity so meticulous, so carefully curated, that it became her armor against a world that doubted her every move. In the absence of military might or masculine dominance, she discovered the one weapon no advisor could wield for her image. And with that realization, the mask of youth was born. It was not a whim of vanity, nor a quirk of royal eccentricity. It was a calculated, strategic masterpiece of self-preservation and public manipulation. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth understood that to rule effectively, she would have to appear eternal. Age, sorrow, sickness, those belong to ordinary mortals. A queen must not bleed, must not wrinkle, must not break. The mask began with her face. In an age where nobility was often measured by how far one could distance oneself from the working classes, pale skin had become the badge of the elite. For Elizabeth, it became her signature. She applied Venetian ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar, to her face daily, coating her skin with a luminous sheen that made her appear untouchable, almost ghostly. At court, her porcelain appearance set her apart like a divine statue. On canvas, it transformed her into a timeless deity. But underneath the alabaster glow, her real skin suffocated. Over the years, the poison seeped deeper, cell by cell, weakening her body, even as her legend grew. The mask thickened in 1562, when Elizabeth contracted smallpox. Though she survived, the illness left her scarred and altered, not just in flesh, but in spirit. From that point forward, her makeup grew heavier, her image more tightly controlled, her portraits more rigidly regulated. The young woman who once rode horses in the open sun now retreated behind layers of white paste, rouge, and powdered wigs. She was no longer merely a monarch, she was a performance. And like all performances, it demanded discipline, illusion, and the silencing of truth. Elizabeth's portraits became state instruments. She personally approved official images, ordering that no painting depict her aging features. In 1596, she issued a royal proclamation that any unflattering portraits were to be destroyed. Artists were given strict templates, most notably the Darnley portrait of 1575 as reference. These images, repeated again and again, presented the same smooth skin, the same wide eyes, the same ageless gaze, regardless of her actual age or health. In this way, she sculpted a vision of herself that was static, powerful, and above all, eternal. The people did not see a woman, they saw the Virgin Queen, the unchanging mother of the realm, too perfect to wither, too divine to die. But the cost of perfection is always hidden in the shadows. As the years wore on, Elizabeth's reliance on cosmetics became a slow suicide in disguise. The white lead from her ceruse entered her bloodstream, weakening her immune system, causing chronic fatigue, hair loss, and even nerve damage. Her teeth, once strong and healthy, began to rot from within. Her gums swelled with infection, her breath soured, and her jaw ached with abscesses that no physician of the age could cure. Yet still, She painted her face each day, layer after layer, masking the rot with powder and the pain with silence. This was the paradox of her reign. The stronger her image became, the weaker her body grew, and yet she could never stop. For to let the mask slip, even for a moment, would be to invite doubt, challenge, rebellion. In the Tudor court, where ambition was a predator and weakness its prey, there was no room for transparency. Elizabeth had built her crown upon illusion, and that illusion demanded unwavering devotion. Even as it poisoned her from the inside out, her courtiers saw the transformation, but none dared speak of it aloud. In hushed whispers, they remarked on her thinning hair, now hidden beneath intricate wigs. They noticed the graying of her skin, the trembling in her hands, the way her once bright eyes dimmed in the candlelight. But to confront the queen with the truth of her mortality was to risk exile or worse. So the court played along. They bowed. They complimented her beauty. They praised her vigor, even as her strength waned before their eyes. The mask did more than shield her from criticism. It isolated her. By demanding that all who approached her maintain the fantasy, she ensured that no one could ever see the real woman beneath. In public, she was regal, radiant, commanding. In private, she was increasingly alone. The mask she had crafted to protect herself had become a prison. And over time, the line between monarch and myth, between flesh and symbol, began to blur. What began as a brilliant act of self-preservation had become a curse. The same tools that elevated her lead, Mercury, silence, the control, were now dragging her toward a slow and visible death. Yet even in her suffering, Elizabeth clung to the mask. It was all she had left. It was all she had ever truly trusted. And in those final years, when her closest advisors had passed, when her body failed, and her heart ached from loss, it was not a crown or a throne that defined her. It was the mask. The beautiful, toxic, enduring mask that the world had fallen in love with. And as history would later uncover, beneath that shimmering surface was not just a queen. There was a woman slowly being undone by the very image that had made her immortal. Behind every throne is a silence deeper than any cathedral. Behind every smile, a storm no court painter dares to brush. And behind the eternal face of Elizabeth, painted white with death and powdered with the illusion of divinity, was a woman unraveling in rooms too grand to admit pain. The longer she reigned, the more her image devoured the self that once lived beneath it. By the time the bells of Westminster had rung to mark her 40th year on the throne, there was little left of the vibrant red-haired princess who once danced through the gardens of Hatfield. What remained was ritual. What remained was porcelain. What remained was the queen. And even that title had become more mask than identity. She lived among shadows, not just those cast by candlelight upon the cold stone floors of Richmond and Whitehall, but shadows of memory, betrayal, and choices too heavy to lift. As the seasons turned and the faces around her changed, one by one, the people she had once leaned on were taken by death or distance. William Cecil, her most loyal counselor, whose mind had mirrored hers in matters of statecraft, was gone. Francis Walsingham, who had protected her throne with a spider's web of spies, was gone. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, her mirror, and opposite, whose execution haunted Elizabeth with a silence louder than screams, was long buried beneath the stones of Fotheringhay. The court grew quieter, not in noise, but in intimacy. The voices that once called her Bess or dared to tease a smile from her lips were replaced by flatterers, clergymen, and cautious courtiers who bowed not just to the crown, but to the fear behind it. What they could not see, or chose not to see, was that Elizabeth, even in her silks and lace, even in the glow of the coronation ring, she never removed, was drowning, not in scandal or shame, but in the slow, suffocating loneliness that only absolute power can bring. She had sacrificed everything a woman might possess in her lifetime marriage: motherhood, vulnerability, rest. And for what? For a country that cheered her victories and whispered of her failures. For a legacy that would never know the texture of her tears or the tremble of her breath when sleep refused her for the 6th night in a row. She had won the war against time in the eyes of her subjects. But the cost was her own sense of being. The queen was immortal, but the woman beneath her was slowly, irrevocably, dying. The physical pain came like fog at first, soft. Then everywhere, her teeth, once pearled and proud, blackened and broke apart in her mouth. Abscesses burst quietly beneath her gums, leaking pain into her jaw and skull with every word spoken and every bite swallowed. Yet she said nothing. No complaint, no request, just silence, the same silence that grew in her chambers, day by day, as she refused her doctors, refused their treatments, refused even the touch of the women who had once helped her dress. It was not pride alone that kept her distant. It was fear. Fear that if anyone witnessed her in weakness, the spell would break, the mask would crack, and with it, the illusion of the queen. And so she chose to sit, not on her bed, but upon cushions piled on the floor like an empress in exile. She sat for hours, for days. In some weeks, she did not lie down at all. Her attendants watched in mute helplessness, understanding that she believed lying down would become surrender. And surrender was the one enemy she had never bowed to. Food was refused. Water, barely touched. She rejected medicine with a wave of the hand. And when spoken to, her replies were so faint, they were often mistaken for sighs. What had once been the most commanding voice in Europe, the voice that defied Philip of Spain, outwitted Catherine de Medici, and kept her court in rapt silence, was now barely more than a whisper pressed between clenched teeth and bleeding gums. Her skin, so meticulously protected from sunlight and painted daily with lead-based ceruse, began to betray her. The grey pallor that once made her appear otherworldly now hinted at death's slow embrace. Sores bloomed beneath her collar, beneath her gowns, unacknowledged but ever present. Her red hair fiery, thick, and once the crown she wore, even without jewels, thinned to a memory. Wigs replaced what nature had reclaimed, styled in the same manner as her portraits dictated, though by now the portrait and the subject had long since parted ways. In art, she remained flawless. In reality, she was vanishing. One of the most harrowing symbols of her decline was the coronation ring she had worn since the beginning, since that cold November day in Westminster, when she vowed herself not to a man but to a realm. It was no ordinary ring. It was her wedding band to England, a circle of gold inscribed with loyalty and purpose. But now, as her body swelled with fluid and her fingers lost their grace, the ring turned cruel. The skin beneath it blistered and split, the flesh rising angrily against the metal that had once symbolized unity. It could not be removed. It had become part of her both bond and wound. In the final days, the queen no longer walked the palace corridors. She no longer held court. She no longer spoke of policy or war or poetry. She simply sat, silent, distant, vanishing. Her court, though filled with pageantry and gold, resembled a tomb. No one dared to name the truth aloud, that their sovereign, their immortal Gloriana, was dying. Even as her body grew colder, her presence was so powerful, so feared, that not a single advisor summoned the courage to prepare the country for her end. They waited, they watched, they prayed, and they whispered in corners that the queen might yet rise, like she always had. But the truth could no longer be masked. Her lungs struggled for air. each breath shallower than the last. Her hands trembled, her eyes, once lit with cunning and wit, grew glassy and still. At one point, she fell into such deep silence that not even the chirp of birds outside the window could break through. For 4 days, she neither moved nor responded. Her attendants stood by like sentinels of grief, powerless in their velvet and lace. Knowing that the light was flickering, there would be no final speech, no rousing words to etch into history, only silence. And then, absence. On the 24th day of March, in the year 1603, Elizabeth Tudor exhaled her final breath within the walls of Richmond Palace. The Queen was dead, but there were no trumpets, no declarations, no crowds in the street. The woman who had spoken the words "I know I have," but the body of a weak and feeble woman. But I have the heart and stomach of a king had chosen to leave the world without a sound. There was no official cause of death, for she had forbidden a post-mortem. No physician was allowed to peer beneath the skin she had once guarded so fiercely. In the end, the mask remained intact, and the truth was buried with her. She was taken to Westminster Abbey, where a grand tomb awaited. The Tudor rose wilted that day, and with it, the dynasty itself. She had named no heir. She had left no instructions. And yet, the realm did not descend into chaos. The transition came swiftly, almost unnaturally so. James, the son of the very woman Elizabeth had executed, ascended to the English throne. The Virgin Queen, who had once called herself married to her people, was now gone, and in her absence, myths were born. Some claimed her corpse exploded in the tomb, a grotesque punishment for her pride. Others whispered of poisoning, of political plots to clear the way for James's rise. But all agreed on one thing: the silence she left behind was louder than any verdict. Behind the painted throne lay not only the truth of a woman's suffering, but a revelation about the nature of power itself. That behind the portraits, the pageantry, and the proclamations, there was always a human being aging, aching, doubting, bleeding, and that perhaps the greatest tragedy of Elizabeth's reign was not how she died, but how she was never allowed to be mortal while she lived. They say that power is heavy, but they never tell you how it weighs most after the body is too weak to carry it. Elizabeth Tudor had worn her crown like a second skull, polished with diplomacy and adorned with myth. But in her final years, it had turned to bone-rigid, silent, and cold against her fading skin. No longer a symbol of sovereignty, it had become a relic fused to her flesh, too late to remove, too sacred to question. And as her body withered, so too did the life behind her gaze. For there is a sorrow that only monarchs understand, and hers was carved from choices made long before her bones began to ache. It was not the loss of youth that haunted her in those closing chapters. It was the loss of intimacy, of honesty, of human softness. The throne had demanded she give up everything that made her warm. No husband, nor child, no confidant who could share her secrets without political consequence. She had been England's bride for over 4 decades, and in return for national adoration, she had forfeited every personal attachment that might have offered solace. Even her affections, when dared, became burdens. Robert Dudley, the man she may have loved more deeply than any other, had died in 1588. His death came with a final letter, one she kept in a small box beside her bed for the rest of her life. She read it often, even as her eyesight dimmed, as if his handwriting might reanimate what her court had taken from her feeling. Memory. The possibility of being simply Elizabeth instead of Majesty. But perhaps the wound that festered deepest was the one that bore the name of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Dudley's stepson, a man who had once filled the vacuum of her loneliness with boldness and fire. He was younger, reckless, charming, and he reminded her of herself in ways that made her heart both sore and dread. She trusted him. She forgave him more than she should have. She gave him command and courtly favor, hoping perhaps he would carry the fire forward. But ambition, once unleashed, is rarely loyal. His rebellion in the year 1601 was not just a political affront, it was personal treason. When she signed his death warrant, her hand trembled not from indecision, but from heartbreak. That act cracked something inside her, and though she never spoke of it in public, those closest to her swore they saw her weep when his name was mentioned in later years. It was not just a loss, it was a betrayal of the very illusion she had built that the Virgin Queen was above longing, above grief, above the collapse of love. Her regrets were not loud. They came at night, in moments when the corridors fell quiet and the fire in the hearth burned low. She would sit alone, staring into the flickering orange light, lips pressed into a line, eyes fogged with battles that had long passed but refused to fade. The ghosts in her court were not just memories, they were decisions. Mary, Queen of Scots, whose execution had stained Elizabeth's reign with moral ambiguity, returned to her in dreams. Some nights she would whisper aloud, "I never truly consented," though whether that was truth or absolution, no one dared to ask. She had spent decades mastering the art of stillness, but in her solitude, the mask faltered, and the woman beneath wept. Her body, meanwhile, continued its descent into agony. The doctors could not treat what they could not name. Abscesses in her jaw spread infections into her blood. Her hands and feet swelled with fluids. Her heart could no longer circulate. Her breath grew shallow, for a voice hoarse. Hirotendance, once accustomed to her sharp wit and biting commands, now hovered like frightened children, unsure whether to reach out or retreat. The court, for all its silks and etiquette, had no language for dying queens. No one dared to say the word end, though it was written in every line of her face, in every step she could no longer take, in every pause that grew longer between her few remaining words. And yet she refused to surrender, not because she feared death, but because she feared what would be left behind once she was no longer there to control the story. All her life, Elizabeth had been a master of narrative. She knew the power of a well-timed pause, a painted image, a crafted phrase. She had turned herself into myth, not by accident, but by design. Her portraits were more than art. They were doctrine. Her speeches, more than politics, they were scripture. To die was not merely to stop breathing. It was to risk having the crown of England passed to someone who had not earned it with the same scars. Someone who would undo her balance of religion, gender, perception, and policy, and worst of all, someone who would look back on her reign and revise it. James of Scotland waited like a silent storm on the northern horizon, son of her greatest rival, born of a queen she had executed, raised under the shadow of religious tension. He had always been the unspoken heir, the name never uttered in her presence. To acknowledge him was to admit an ending, and endings, to Elizabeth, were dangerous. So she ruled until the very breath before her last, refusing to name him, refusing to bow, even in the face of her own extinction. That, too was part of the mask. The queen dies as she lived, not yielding, not confessing, not conceding. But death, when it finally came, was not a grand affair. It did not roar through the halls. It crept in quietly, like candle smoke. The crown slipped not from her head, but from her presence, vanishing into the air as her breath stilled. The ring she could no longer remove, cut into her finger like a final vow, one sealed in blood. She left no heir, no final words, no farewell address to a nation that owed her its golden age. She simply ceased to be, and the silence she left behind was deafening. And then came the burial. and with it, the beginning of the stories. Some claimed her corpse had swollen so badly that it ruptured inside the coffin, spreading a foul stench that overpowered the abbey. Others whispered of poison, an inside job meant to clear the way for James. There were even darker tales, ones too tangled in superstition to be spoken openly. But the truth was both simpler and more devastating. She died not from conspiracy or blade, but from a body crushed beneath the weight of too many unspoken truths, too many untreated wounds, too many years pretending to be immortal. Historians would later try to explain her death with clinical clarity: lead poisoning from her makeup, sepsis from dental infections, pneumonia from standing too long on cold floors without rest. But none of these diagnoses capture the essence of what killed her. She was not destroyed by one illness, but by a lifetime of refusal. Refusal to rest, refusal to love freely, refusal to age in public, refusal to be anything less than divine. In the end, it was not disease that claimed her. It was performance. It was expectation. It was legacy. The crown of England, once a gilded symbol upon her youthful brow, had become something far more haunting, a crown of regret and bone, worn until her last breath, engraved with names never spoken, sorrows never mourned, and love never dared. When the people gathered outside the abbey to hear the bells toll her passing, they wept not only for a queen, but for the death of an era shaped by a woman who had refused to be small. Even in her suffering, she had outlived her enemies, outwitted her rivals, and outlasted her doubts. But in the end, the only person she could not defeat was herself. It was a death both quiet and thunderous, a departure wrapped in velvet silence, yet echoing through the marbled corridors of Europe like a cracked bell. Elizabeth Tudor had slipped from the world, not with proclamation, nor with regal finality, but with a breath too thin to be heard, a closing of eyes that no one dared call final until the stillness lingered too long. And yet in her passing, she performed one final act of power. She handed the crown not just to a man, but to a new age. Her death crowned a dynasty, and with it, the world turned its gaze from Gloriana to the son of her executed cousin. The Tudor sun had set, the Stuart moon was rising. News of her death did not erupt into the streets. There were no sudden outbursts of public mourning, no grand royal spectacle. Her body was too sacred, her image too rigidly curated to allow for anything so mortal. Her death had been years in the making, a slow erasure that began in solitude and ended in myth. The people had watched her fade, had whispered of her absences, her silences, her spectral presence behind embroidered veils, but they never spoke the truth aloud until the palace finally confirmed what her silence had already confessed. On the 24th day of March, in the year 1603, the Virgin Queen was gone, and with her, the Tudor name slipped into the pages of history. But power cannot remain unheld for long. In that brief window between her death and the crowning of the next monarch, there was a breathless vacuum, a moment of suspended reality where England stood without a voice, without a face, without a sovereign, and into that void, James of Scotland began his silent march southward. James, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-grandson of Henry VII, had always been the unspoken solution to England's problem of succession. Elizabeth, ever the master of ambiguity, had never named him. She had danced around the question of heirs for decades, weaving herself into a permanent role as the living embodiment of the kingdom itself. She was England. To suggest another monarch was to suggest her fallibility, her mortality, and so she never did. But her ministers, with their quiet pragmatism and whispered alliances, had long prepared for the inevitable. When her breath stopped, they moved. Letters were sent. Messengers rode with urgency, and James, still in Edinburgh, received the crown like a ghost claim, earned not by conquest, nor inheritance proclaimed, but by the absence of objection. He did not rush. He moved with caution, with calculation, as if aware that he was walking into a legend still warm from its final breath. Elizabeth's body lay cold in Richmond, but her myth still stirred in the streets of London, in the hearts of courtiers who had never known another ruler, in the minds of poets who still dreamed of her hand upon their verses. James knew that his reign would begin not in glory, but in comparison, and that comparison would be brutal. When he arrived, the air was heavy. The people lined the roads not in jubilation, but in weary silence. They did not cheer as loudly as they might have for a prince born of English soil. They did not throw petals with the same fervour that had marked Elizabeth's processions. They watched, they measured, they remembered. For nearly half a century, Elizabeth had been more than a ruler. She had been the pulse of the realm. James, with his foreign mannerisms, his thick tongue, his unfamiliar gait, it was not just a new king. He was a reminder that England was now stepping into the unknown. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's body was being prepared not just for burial, but for legend. Her final journey through London was a performance in death. Much like her life had been, the coffin was draped in cloth of gold. The hearse, drawn by horses clad in mourning black. Onlookers fell silent as the procession passed, some bowing, some weeping, some staring with expressions unreadable. It was not just a queen they buried that day, it was an idea. A stability forged in a woman's will, a vision of monarchy so meticulously controlled that even in decay, it refused to crack. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey was constructed to reflect her power, grand, elevated, eternal. She was laid beside her half-sister, Mary Tudor, whom she had both avenged and succeeded in death. The two daughters of Henry VIII shared a resting place they had never shared in life. And though their religious ideologies clashed and their reputations stood in contrast, their bones now slept beneath the same stone. While the crown moved forward without them, the transition of power was smoother than anyone had dared hope. No uprisings, no foreign invasions, no disputed claims. The machinery of monarchy, well-oiled by Elizabeth's long years of control, clicked into place for James without bloodshed. But that smoothness was deceptive. Beneath the polished surface, something had changed. The court grew colder, the rituals less sacred. The throne, once occupied by a woman who had bent it into poetry and performance, now became a tool of governance. Stripped of mystery, James ruled with logic, with law, with the calculated mind of a scholar. He brought unity between crowns. Yes, but he could not replace the soul that had once sat upon that seat. And so, almost immediately, the cult of Elizabeth began, in plays, in sermons, in political pamphlets. She rose again, not as the woman who died in silence, frail and shaking, but as the flame-haired queen who had defied the Armada, who had never married, who had made England strong through the sheer force of her persona. Artists painted her long after her death, continuing the image she herself had approved. Writers compared her to Deborah, to Astrea, to Diana, casting her among the goddesses she once had only impersonated. Her reign became the Golden Age not because of its perfection, but because she had wrapped it in gold leaf. James, despite his intelligence and lineage, could never match the ghost he followed. His own mother, Mary, had died under Elizabeth's seal. His very crown had come through the execution of the woman who gave him life. And now he ruled a kingdom still whispering the name of the woman who had taken that life. It was a tangled inheritance, and one he bore with the stiffness of a man who knew he would never truly be loved by the people as she had been. In private, he dismissed the adoration of Elizabeth as foolish idolatry. He preferred theology to symbolism, debate to pageantry. But in public, he allowed the myth to remain untouched. He needed her legend to stabilize his rule, and so the memory of Elizabeth became a cornerstone of Stuart legitimacy, even as it cast a long, unshakable shadow across it. But the question remained, and still remains today, what had Elizabeth's death truly crowned? A new dynasty? Certainly, but perhaps more profoundly, it crowned the idea of monarchy itself, not as a birthright, but as a story carefully told. Her death marked the moment when power, performance, and persona fused so tightly that even the truth of her suffering, her loneliness, her decline, became secondary to the image she left behind. In dying, as she did in silence, in mystery, in orchestrated withdrawal, she ensured that the last chapter of her reign was one written in myth, and so, the Virgin Queen. In life, a strategist, and in death, an architect of memory, gave her final gift to England. She gave them the idea of a ruler not bound by time, not tarnished by age, not diminished by frailty. She gave them a sovereign who could be mourned without discomfort, remembered without complication, and enshrined without dissent. In doing so, she did not just end a dynasty. She immortalized one, a woman, a monarch, a symbol, a myth, Elizabeth I, whose death crowned the next king, also crowned herself in eternity. They never opened her body. That was her command. No blade was to cut the flesh of Gloriana. No doctor permitted to dissect the sovereign who had defied popes and kings. She had spent her life building a body that was not merely flesh, but symbol, shrine, performance untouchable by time, unstained by weakness, immune to mortality. And so, when she died, her wish was honored. She was wrapped, sealed, and lowered into the stone arms of Westminster, her skin untouched by the cold curiosity of medicine. But, century later, when myth began to crack under the weight of modern inquiry, the scalpel returned not to her corpse, but to her legend, and in that act of retrospective dissection, they performed what she had forbidden the autopsy of a queen. It began not with scandal, but with science, a quiet episode of a quiet show. Royal autopsy, where pathologists and historians gathered not around a body, but around a question: what truly killed Elizabeth Tudor? Not just what ended her reign, but what eroded her from within. For though her death certificate listed no cause, and her tomb offered no answers, the symptoms gathered from letters, diaries, observations whispered behind tapestries remained like bruises on parchment. They spoke of swollen limbs, blackened teeth, unhealed sores, silence, confusion, decay. These were not metaphors. They were medical clues. Dr. Brett Locker, a forensic pathologist, and Professor Alice Roberts, a biological anthropologist, began to thread the evidence together, like surgeons restitching a wound. There was no body, but there was data reports from her attendants, posthumous sketches, the court gossip recorded with unintended clinical precision Elizabeth's decline, long romanticized as the melancholy of a fading sovereign, was re-evaluated under harsh fluorescence. What they found was not merely interesting, it was tragic. The first wound revealed was her mouth, a battlefield. Her teeth, once gleaming in courtly smiles, had rotted into jagged stumps. Her gums had become nests of infection. There were abscesses deep, festering pockets of pus that had likely spread pain into her jaw. Sinuses, throat. Eating would have been excruciating. Speaking, a torment. And yet, she had continued to address ambassadors, to smile for artists, to receive poetry, as if her mouth were not a cave of agony, infection, untreated and unspoken, can become systemic. Herblul, poisoned, her strength slowly drained, and all of it hidden beneath the smile she painted every morning. But it was not just infection. The second revelation was chemical. Lead, heavy, toxic, royal. For decades, Elizabeth had applied Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic made from white lead, to her skin. It gave her that luminous, ghostly glow, a signature of power and purity. But what it also gave her was illness. Lead does not rest on the skin. It burrows into the bloodstream, lodges in the bones, corrodes the nervous system. Over time, it can cause fatigue, hair loss, neurological decline, tremors, emotional instability. The symptoms matched. Her thinning hair, her grey, brittle skin, her increasing silences, her refusal to eat, her swan glance, her mind, once sharp enough to outwit empires, becoming fogged with confusion. Every day she wore the mask. It was feeding her death. Professor Roberts pointed to something deeper still. Lead poisoning doesn't just injure the body, it distorts perception, isolates emotion, makes the world less comprehensible. In her final months, Elizabeth refused to lie down, convinced that if she did, she would never rise again. She remained seated on cushions for days. She stopped sleeping. She stopped speaking. This was not just grief. Though grief there was in abundance, it was the unraveling of cognition, the erosion of identity, not a queen slowly accepting death, but a woman disintegrating without the language to explain it. And then came the lungs. The final failure, as they reviewed the symptoms: shortness of breath, extreme fatigue, polylepsis, swelling. They traced a line not to the heart, nor the brain, but to the chest. Elizabeth, they concluded, died of bronchial pneumonia, a fluid build-up in the lungs, cutting off oxygen, weakening the heart, inviting infection into the bloodstream. Sepsis, a death as old as civilization, as common as rain. And yet, when woven into the tapestry of her decay, it felt shattering. For centuries, poets and politicians had imagined her death as a grand drama, perhaps poisoned by her enemies, perhaps consumed by unspoken guilt. But no, it was the lungs. It was infection. It was the slow drowning from within. Nothing poetic, everything human. And perhaps that is the most painful incision this modern autopsy made, not upon her image, but upon our need for myth. Elizabeth did not die in grandeur. She died in silence, in pain, in the same manner as countless others, too late for medicine, too proud for help, too tightly wrapped in the fabric of who she was supposed to be. In her final days, she was not a monarch, nor an icon, but a woman trapped in a body too damaged to serve her legend. The body had become the enemy, and she had no words left to protest. The coronation ring, once the symbol of her marriage to England, had become embedded in her flesh. Swelling made it impossible to remove. The gold had turned into a vice. It cut her. It bruised her. It held her long after her heart had grown tired. If ever there were a symbol of her reign's bitter poetry, it was that a ring that once crowned her, now slicing into her finger, too sacred to remove, too painful to bear. When the program aired, many viewers found the conclusions anticlimactic: pneumonia, lead poisoning, dental sepsis. Could this truly be the end of a monarch who had stood taller than history? But others, those with quieter hearts and fewer illusions, understood the gravity. It was not just a diagnosis. It was a revelation. Elizabeth's death was not a punishment. It was not a mystery. It was a price for refusing rest, a price for silencing pain, a price for never letting anyone see the woman beneath the crown. The autopsy did not desecrate her memory. It clarified it. It restored her humanity. It stripped away the paint, the portraiture, the panegyrics, and revealed the tissue underneath. And there, in the swollen hands, the decayed mouth, the quiet collapse, we saw not a failure, but a miracle. That someone so wounded had ruled so well. That someone so burdened had loved a kingdom more than she loved herself. That someone slowly poisoned by her own mask had smiled into the faces of nations and never let them know she was bleeding. No monument will ever show the truth of her final hours. No painting will capture the quiet terror of dying while still trying to appear divine. But the records remain. The scars, retold in scientific language, offer a posthumous mercy. They tell us that Elizabeth I was not a goddess. She was something harder, something braver. She was a woman who carried the weight of myth on bones that cracked, on blood that boiled, on breath that finally, mercifully, stopped. In death, they could not open her. So we did it centuries later, and what we found was not weakness. It was sacrifice. The stone is smooth now, worn by centuries of curious footsteps and reverent silence. And yet beneath it, the stillness is not complete. Westminster Abbey holds many dead kings and queens, poets and generals, heroes and hypocrites, but none quite like her. Elizabeth Tudor lies beneath alabaster and Latin inscription, beneath angels carved in mourning, beneath the careful order of state funeral and sacred architecture. But those who stand long enough beside her tomb, who listen not with ears, but with a gentler part of themselves, say there is something else beneath the stone, something that has never fully settled, a whisper, a question, a presence that cannot quite be buried. The tomb does not sleep. It remembers. She was placed there in grandeur. Of course, no queen of her stature could be laid to rest without ceremony. The funeral procession wound its way through London like a river of black velvet. Horses draped in mourning cloth, heralds bearing her arms, a coffin covered in cloth of gold. Thousands stood in silence, watching a body become a legend. The woman who had ruled for 45 years, who had redefined monarchy itself, was now still. Her silence would have suited her. She had always preferred the illusion of serenity, even when storms raged beneath her skin. But unlike the stillness of her interment, the symbolism of her burial was noisy, deliberate, pointed. She was placed atop her half-sister, Mary Tudor, in a shared tomb that said more about England's history than either woman could have spoken in life. Two queens, one Catholic, one Protestant, one called Bloody, one called Gloriana, one who had lit fires, one who had worn masks. Now, sisters in stone. The Latin inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave." Here rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection. Yet they had not lived as sisters. They had ruled in contradiction. Their alliance in death was political, not spiritual. And yet, the tomb remains, and it draws people still. Tourists, pilgrims, skeptics. Some come with cameras, some with prayers, some with nothing more than a feeling they can't quite name. They read the dates, they stare at the crown sculpted on her head. They speak softly in her presence, and they ask, without asking, is she still here? Because something lingers. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, not a rattling chain, not a pale figure drifting through cloisters. No. What lingers is more intimate. It is the unresolved nature of who she was. The conflict between the sovereign and the woman, between the eternal image and the mortal cost. For over 400 years, her tomb has been sealed, her body untouched. Unlike many monarchs whose remains have been exhumed, analyzed, or relocated, Elizabeth's has remained undisturbed, not out of neglect, but out of fear. Fear that the myth might not survive contact with reality. Fear that opening the tomb might open something else, a truth too raw, too human. It is one of the great ironies of English history that the queen who controlled every image of herself, who forbade post-mortem examination, who curated her face like a relic, is now the subject of endless curiosity. Her final command was, "Do not look." And so we keep looking. There have been requests. Of course, scientists and historians have petitioned to examine her remains, to extract DNA, to study the lead content in her bones, to confirm, finally and definitively, the theories proposed in modern autopsies. Was it lead poisoning? Was it pneumonia? Was her blood poisoned by years of cosmetic warfare? But the tomb remains sealed. Parliament has never approved an exhumation. The Church refuses to disturb the sanctity of the grave. And perhaps, on some level, we understand why. There is something sacred in the mystery, something poetic in her silence. To break the seal would be to strip her of the final privacy she ever possessed. And yet the whispers persist. Stories emerge like mist from the floorstones, that her coffin swelled and burst with rot, releasing a stench so foul the abbey had to be evacuated, that her skin turned to parchment, her bones discolored from lead, her jaw fused, shut in silent rebellion, that she wore her coronation ring until it carved itself into her flesh. A final marriage to a nation that watched her suffer, but never allowed her to stop. That beneath her layers of cloth, the body was already disappearing before the tomb ever closed. That she refused embalming, that she insisted her face not be touched, even in death, and perhaps most disturbing of all, that the silence was by design. That Elizabeth did not die with a whisper by accident, but by choice. That her refusal to speak in those final days was not illness or madness. But defiance. That her last act of power was to take the story with her to the grave, to the dark, to the sealed stone that even now pulses with questions no historian can answer. That silence, perhaps, is her final legacy. Not the speeches, not the portraits, not the poetry, but the hush that followed her last breath, echoing through time. Because to this day, no one has heard her last words. No one recorded them. Because none were spoken. The woman who had dazzled courts with her wit, who had seduced and destroyed with language, who had held kingdoms at bay with a sentence, died in muteness. Her lips closed, her eyes distant, her voice gone, not even a whisper for the annals. And in that muteness, we find a strange intimacy, as if, finally, she had turned inward, refusing to share even a final phrase with the world she had held captive for decades, a refusal that speaks louder than any farewell. And so the tomb still whispers not in words, but in absence, in the fact that no one truly knows what lies beneath, in the thousands of people who stand before it each year and ask themselves, was she lonely? Was she afraid? Did she suffer more than she showed? In the scholars who write her name with awe, but cannot agree on who she was beneath the crown. In the artists who still try to paint her without truly seeing her face. In the children who walk past, too young to know history, but old enough to feel that someone important rests here. Because resting is what we say the dead do. But perhaps Elizabeth never fully did. Perhaps she is still holding something beneath the stone. Not a haunting, but a withholding. The same skill she used in life. The same ability to give just enough to be worshipped, and never enough to be known. And that, in the end, may be her final lesson. That power lies not only in speech, but in silence. Not only in legacy, but in mystery. That a tomb can be more than a box of bones. It can be a mirror. For what we see when we look at Elizabeth's tomb depends on what we bring with us. Some see a queen, others a tyrant. Some see a saint, others a prisoner. Some hear nothing, others hear the quiet rumble of history, turning beneath stone. And some those who come not with cameras, but with questions leave feeling as though the ground itself had breathed beneath their feet. No monarch has ever ruled like her. No monarch has ever died like her. And no monarch, in all the centuries since, has left behind a silence as eloquent, as enduring, or as carefully constructed as the one she buried with her. The tomb has not opened, and yet it speaks. History is not written in ink alone. It is carved by silence just as deeply, and when Elizabeth Tudor fell silent, the world parchment and people alike leaned in to listen. For all her letters, proclamations, speeches crafted with surgical precision, it is her final refusal to speak that has echoed loudest. That silence, that deliberate absence of explanation, apology, confession, or farewell. Why did something no royal decree ever? Could it give birth to a story that would never stop changing? She had spent her life mastering language, twisting it, weaponizing it, wrapping it in silk or steel as the moment required. Her words defeated invaders, quelled rebellions, seduced suitors, and outwitted every statesman who mistook her for a figurehead. But in the end, she wielded silence like a final sword. In her last days, when attendants begged for comfort, when doctors leaned in for answers, when the court waited breathlessly for some signal of succession or salvation, she said nothing, no last statement for the record, no whispered name of an heir, no tearful recollection of her triumphs or regrets, just long, haunted stillness, and that silence became the blank page upon which everyone else began to write. It started almost immediately, even as her body cooled. Stories ignited. Some claimed she had finally gone mad, refusing food and water, not from pain, but from divine visions. Others whispered that she had confessed, in the final hours, to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, being a mistake, a ghost that had never stopped following her. Some insisted she had died of heartbreak over the Earl of Essex. Others claimed poison. And then, as the years passed, the stories swelled into fables, that her heart had stopped while seated upright, clutching the ring of her coronation, that her skin had turned white as her ceruse, so indistinguishable from death, that even her ladies feared she had become something not quite human, that her refusal to lie down before death came was an act of spiritual defiance that even God himself would have to come for her standing. What had begun as ambiguity grew into law, then myth, then a national theology. The Elizabeth, who had ruled with steel and glitter, became a canvas. Painters gave her the body of a goddess. Writers framed her as the second coming of Deborah, or Astrea. Even Protestant sermons invoked her as divinely chosen, a woman who had transcended female weakness to embody the will of heaven. But none of it could have happened had she not stayed silent. Had she given the world her final words, had she left behind a neat sentence, "A definitiva I de content," or "Let England flourish," perhaps her myth would have hardened into something finite. But she did not. She left a void, and in that void, imagination flourished. It is no coincidence that Shakespeare's greatest plays unfolded during the twilight of her reign. He too knew the power of unspoken things, the pregnant pause, the breath before betrayal, the silence after tragedy. When Elizabeth died, the stage of England widened. Her silence became not just an absence of speech, but a performance in itself. And like all performances, it demanded interpretation. Who was she? Really a virgin, a master of control, a martyr to power, a manipulator of perception, or just a lonely woman who built a throne of marble atop a body that ached every day for the permission to be human? She had lived between contradictions. Gloriana, the untouchable, and Bess, the frightened girl locked in the tower during her sister's reign. A woman who laughed with poets and signed death warrants in the same hour. A monarch who crushed rebellion with fire but shrank from mirrors as she aged. A queen who forbade the truth of her appearance. yet ruled longer than any monarch of her time. The silence she left behind did not erase those contradictions. It illuminated them. And in that glow, generations have tried to define her. In the Victorian age, she became the icon of empire, her chastity synonymous with national virtue. In modern feminist retellings, she is reimagined as a woman who bent history to her will, who carved power from a world that would have preferred her powerless. In more critical corners, she is seen as cold, as emotionally manipulative, as a ruler who sacrificed personal joy to maintain an illusion. And yet, no version fully satisfies. No version quite fits. Because the real Elizabeth, the one who suffered, laughed, feared, ruled, and ultimately died, refused to give herself away, even in death, especially in death. And this is the truth of silence. It does not remain empty. It demands to be filled. It invites projection. It offers a mirror, not a window. Her refusal to speak became an act of supreme authorship. She gave us everything, except the ending. And in doing so, she gave us the story that never finishes. The monarch who can be made anew in every age. The woman who stands for what each generation most fears, envies, or admires. The silence that rewrote her story is the same silence that keeps it alive. Scholars still argue over the most basic facts. Did she ever truly love Dudley? Did she mourn the death she ordered? Did she believe herself chosen by God? Or did she simply understand that the illusion of divinity could tame the ambitions of men? Did she want to be remembered as more than a queen, as something beyond human? Or did she, in the final hours, long simply to be held? Her letters do not answer. Her portrait lie. Her tomb is sealed. The witnesses are long dead. And the words she did speak in life have been bent by centuries of repetition. All that remains is that silence, and it has outlasted everything. But if silence can rewrite a story, it can also redeem it. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Elizabeth is not the empire she preserved, nor the poetry she inspired, nor even the enemies she outlived, but that she remains unknown. That the deeper one goes into her story, the more she slips away. That the more precisely one tries to define her, the more she becomes something else. That she is not a statue to be catalogued, but a shadow that demands movement. And in that movement, in that refusal to be captured, there is freedom. We search her face in paintings, trying to detect fatigue beneath the lead. We quote her speeches, hoping to catch a glimpse of the private heart beating behind the public pose. We walk to her tomb and wonder whether she found peace. And perhaps that is all she ever wanted to be remembered, not as a relic, but as a question. The silence she left behind did not end her story. It only ensured we would never stop telling it. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the flicker of candlelight soften the edges of time. Let the great halls grow quiet. The footsteps of courtiers fade into stone. The rustle of silk fall into stillness. Outside, the abbey bells have long since rung their final hour. The queen is gone. The court is asleep. And now, in this hush that lingers beyond history, we return not to the throne, not to the war rooms or banquets or battles, but to something simpler, a reflection, a moment, a whisper tucked between then and now, the kind of truth that arrives only when the world is no longer watching. We have travelled far, haven't we? Through coronations and poison, through portraits and whispers, through silence and myth and illness and legend. We have watched a woman transform herself into a monument and carry the weight of that stone crown until it broke her bones. We have traced the outlines of her mask, studied the alchemy of her silence, listened to the tomb she left behind. But now, as all stories must, this one softens. It exhales. It lets go of the gold and the grime, and it begins to ask the questions that no historian can answer, not because they are unspeakable, but because they are too human. What did she dream of? That last winter, did her mind return to the garden paths of Hatfield, to the scent of wood smoke, to the sound of her brother's laughter before the world grew sharp? Did she remember her mother's voice, the one history erased? Or was it all court shadows and echoing rooms by then, faces she loved and lost, names she once signed into death? Did she mourn what she gave up? Or did she believe, truly, that it was worth it? No one was there in the final moment. No one recorded a last breath. No hand held hers. No lover bent close. No diary entry survives. And so we imagine, not out of idle curiosity, but because we need to, because the soul longs to understand the cost of greatness, because we, too, wonder what we will leave behind, what story the world will write in our place. Elizabeth's silence becomes our canvas. Perhaps she was at peace. Perhaps the slow unthreading of her legend gave her rest at last. Or perhaps the quiet was heavy, full of things unsaid, like the names of those she'd loved and let go. The children she never had. The mirror she hadn't looked into in years. Perhaps her thoughts flickered like candle flames, sharp, brief, disappearing before they could be caught. Or maybe she simply slipped away, the way she had always lived on her own terms. And what of us? Now, we are not monarchs. We do not wear lead masks or sign treaties with foreign kings. We are not painted as gods, nor buried in Westminster beneath lions and Latin. But still, her story touches something in us, something tender, something unresolved, because we know what it means to hide behind strength. We know what it feels like to carry the weight of an identity shaped by others. We know the ache of longing and the fear of being truly seen. And most of all, we know silence. The silence we keep for protection. The silence we carry out of pride. The silence that follows us through our own versions of power. Our own lonely victories. Our own masked joys. In the end, Elizabeth's story is not just about queenship or history. It's about being human inside, something larger than you. It's about trying to control the story and learning, too late, that no one ever really does. It's about legacy, the hope that what you gave will matter more than what you lacked. And it's about love, in all the forms it never took. So here we are, century later, and we still whisper her name. Not because she was perfect, but because she was not. Because she built herself from ruin and fear and expectation, and became something impossible, and bore the price of that impossibility in silence. Because she made herself unforgettable, not by claiming perfection, but by refusing to be claimed at all, because even now, after all the portraits have faded and the vaults have sealed, we still see her somewhere between candlelight and memory, crown and girlhood, steel and softness. We see her not as a figurehead, but as a mirror. And perhaps, tonight, that is enough. So sleep now. Let the stories settle. Let the myths fall silent. Just for a while. You've walked with a queen who built herself from smoke and iron. Now walk with yourself with all your scars. Your silence. Your longing to be remembered. Not for the mask you wear, but for the truth you carry. History may not remember it, but the soul does, and that is where the real story lives. Good night. Majesty. You can rest now. We heard you even in your silence.